But I think when interacting with diverse populations, the thing that you have to do is include them. So this is something also related to that topic that we were talking about with disability. Have someone with a disability on your board. Have somebody who is being represented actually photo directing, or have somebody who is involved in the group actually making decisions. Because if you can, aside from tokenizing, which is also something you don't want to do, this is already kind of a step towards providing agency, providing representation, and not being afraid to maybe make some mistakes, right? Because the alternative to this is
Hello, and welcome back to Popping Bubbles podcast, where we try to pop the bubbles between business and academic guests, I guess.
Yes.
We're your hosts, Liza and Stefan.
Yeah. And last episode, we talked about mental health and well-being in teams. And this episode, we're talking about diversity and inclusion with Vicky and Jean-Louis. So maybe, Vicky, you want to start? Who are you?
Who am I? Big question. Yeah, so I wear various hats, but I think most relevant for this conversation is that I'm the co-founder and co-director of Climate Mosaic, and that's a non-profit very much focused on ensuring that we have a diverse and inclusive ecosystem when we're tackling climate change. And we have a particular focus on founders and investors, so very much looking at the startup ecosystem.
It's really interesting. It's like, so how we'll get to that. First, Jean-Louis, I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, we do have questions.
We have questions. Jean-Louis, please.
I'm Gian. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam. I teach in the communication science department, and I'm also a researcher that's focusing on two sort of main lines of research. One is looking at mental health in migrants, and the other is looking at critical notions of health and fitness.
Oh, that's really cool.
That's your current research.
That's my current
the
research.
podcast research.
Yes, the podcast research, exactly. We'll talk about that as well.
So you go by Gian. Then.
Gian, yes,
Gian. Okay.
exactly.
Good to know. Yes, so Gian has a podcast as well, so
Yes.
check it out.
It's called the Critical Beings Podcast.
Yes.
Yeah. So and if you could check it out and then by all means comment, that would be very, very helpful also for my research.
Yeah.
Yes, if you could comment on our podcast.
Yes.
As well.
Great.
I think the whole podcast team is going to go to that podcast and have a
Hopefully
look.
comment.
Yeah. Podcast team.
So, Vicky, Climate Mosaic, because I'm very intrigued where that came from, because I think you've also worked at a different organization in the past, or started a different organization in the past. How did you enroll in that?
Yeah, I've had a kind of interesting journey where I'm a physicist originally. I went into nuclear decommissioning. I then moved to Japan. I worked for startups in Japan. And then I ended up in the investor world, which was, a whole new thing. And when I joined, I'd kind of experienced that and expected, in terms of my background, to come from very non-diverse environments. And when I got into this forefront of innovation in the Netherlands, has a great perception as this super inclusive, tolerant country, I was expecting to see a completely different world. And what I saw was, okay, no, actually, we still have a diversity problem here. And it's really important because, I had a lot of influences. There's an amazing book called Invisible Women. Maybe you've heard about it. But basically, if you're coming up with solutions in a specific space and you only have specific groups of people doing this, then there's other groups of people that are going to get left behind. And whilst I was investing in companies, I was desperately looking for more diverse founders, more diverse solutions, and I wasn't seeing it. So I wanted to do something about this. I met my amazing co-founder Shruti, who was experiencing the same in London, and we decided to kick Climate Mosaic off.
So, can I ask how long ago did you start Climate Mosaic?
Climate Mosaic we properly launched about 18 months ago.
Oh wow, so it's pretty new.
Pretty new, but super exciting is the uptake. Like there was definitely a demand for it. We're in the UK, we're in the Netherlands, we're in Germany. We have 200 members, and we're growing really quick. If anything, we're trying to limit the growth and make sure what we're building is really valuable. But it's very exciting.
So cool.
So, and maybe a question that I had, because you're working with founders and with venture capitalists, I guess.
Yeah.
Those two things both to me seem like they're quite like hard to get into. I don't know how you would be in the right circles to become a founder nor a venture capitalist. Like how do you aim to make that like attainable for an equal amount of people and from different backgrounds, etc.?
To become like a founder in any kind of space, I think it takes confidence and it takes network. And the network also helps you build that confidence. So my real thesis behind Climate Mosaic, and this is what Shruti agreed with too, is the main thing that you need is to have kind of a support network of people that kind of relate to you, but also in the space that you're in. So if we take climate, it's really useful if you have a network of people also in climate. And then you can also make this even more specific, really focus groups of 12 people, and they're going to support you in getting what you need.
Maybe this is a preconceived notion, maybe it's not, but I feel like venture capitalism is like a very white man's world. Is that true? You don't have to answer. If it's
No. Honestly, it is true, and the data shows that. So if you look at London in particular, or the UK, like 65% of the partners at venture capital funds.
Statistics.
Yeah,
I read the website. I was surprised. Okay, not surprised. Maybe I expected something like that. But the fact that there was like actual statistics on that, and I was reading all of it, and I was like, oh my god, we're really deep down.
Yeah,
there.
It's shocking. So, I mean, when you look at the makeup of the funds, I mean, you do get more diversity at the more junior levels, but when you look at partners, it's very much what you were describing. It is changing, but slowly. And then when you look on the founder side, for me, that's an even bleaker picture. Like less than 1% of funding goes to all-female teams. 1.3% of funding goes to teams of ethnic minority mixes, and that's the only data we have, because I've actively tried to improve on that data, but it's very hard to get. So this is the picture we have for these two elements of diversity, but diversity is of course so broad, and we have no idea. But yeah, the picture isn't amazing. But in terms of getting into the space, I think what they do see is if you do have funds where it's a more diverse group of investors, they're more likely to recruit people from a diverse background. So that's part of the initiative of Climate Mosaic. And what I also think is, just to be a very pragmatic piece of advice, given what you told me about the listeners of this podcast, I think you don't have to go through traditional routes necessarily. It does help. So speaking from different socioeconomic backgrounds and things, I came very much through an energy specialist route, and I went to an energy specialist venture capital fund. So if you can build up your expertise in your area and then move into venture capital, that also works. Yeah.
Gian, do you want to respond to that? Like, do you want to weigh in on this?
What are my thoughts on venture capitalism?
Well, I mean, obviously, you've also studied gender and different. I don't like saying the word race. I don't feel like that's
but that's actually a really interesting point. So one of the papers that I've written actually speaks to the point, Vicky, you were making around the lack of access to data around diversity, right? So this paper that I'm talking about, it talks about racial unspeakability, and it's sort of this discursive notion that race is rendered not only taboo but actually impossible to discuss. And so because we don't discuss it, it's not as though it does not exist. Rather, it becomes impossible to address, to explore, to illuminate, right? And so in that case, when we talk about, for example, a lack of diversity, first we have to have the terms to discuss diversity. So if we're not talking about race, if we're not talking about gender, if we're not talking about ability status, if we're not talking about body size, if we're not talking about religion, I mean, there are so many things that we talk about. There's a scholar who calls it the Rolodex of identity categories. If we don't have that vocabulary, then it's impossible to even begin to address. So you can say race is the takeaway from there.
You know, it's so funny that you were saying this, because this reminds me very much of our last episode when we were talking about mental health and how there's also a lack of vocabulary to talk about mental health and what you're feeling, and how it then makes it very hard to discuss, right?
Yeah. So there's definitely parallels there. And even, I mean, if we want to talk about, for example, mental health in diverse categories, this is one of my areas of research as well, mental health in migrants, we noticed that from the data, there's a lot of stigma around, for example, those who are low language proficiency, right? So if in my data sample is migrants in the Netherlands, for example. And there's definitely, we had to use, for example, specific language, different sort of translation tools, for example, and because it's all around this notion of linguistic diversity, but then also really goes down to the language and the discourse around mental health. And it very much ties into such sort of a diverse sample, kind of differing from, quote unquote, Western ideals of what constitutes mental health. It's very much all kind of intertwined.
Interesting, because in the end, I feel with Climate Mosaic, you want to make it more diverse in investors and also startup founders, right? So, I mean, yeah, I just, it feels like a hard thing to achieve.
It is hard, and actually really to your point now, we thought for ages, how do we even define what is diverse? Like who can join and who can be a part of this? Because I mean the whole thing is that it's a mosaic, like it's a mosaic of all different shapes, sizes, colors, nationalities, whatever. But when people sign up, how do we even say like, okay, can you let us know that you're diverse? Like, what a question.
Yeah, that would be really weird.
Yeah. So we try and make it very much open in a sense, like you self-identify which support groups you would like to be a part of, and is that something about nationality? Is that something around mental health? And you don't have to specify anything. You just say, hey, I want to be a part of this. That's how we tried to circumnavigate this, but would love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, in that regard, this is something that I've encountered also in terms. I teach DEI. As sort of an executive master, so it's people who are in industry who are looking to sort of improve on their skills in terms of navigating a diverse workforce, let's say. And one of the things that I always say is, it's a heuristic. We are imperfect beings, and we go through with tools that work for a specific amount of time, and when we realize they no longer work for us, we can discard them. And so in that sense, if your strategy is eliciting a certain kind of result, then maybe you want to reevaluate. But if you have, for example, something that maybe is a little bit cringe or a little, strange, or it makes you feel uncomfortable, then maybe my question is not so much why do we do that, but why does it make us feel this way? I think that's really important to kind of interrogate our sort of underlying ideologies around what constitutes diversity. And so if, for example, we're really focused on nationality, if we're really focused on religion, we have to kind of think about the context as well. So for example, for myself, I come from the United States where race is quite prevalent, right? We talk a lot about it. I myself am a racialized person. I'm half black and half Mexican, and those kinds of things are super important in the American context. Whereas, when I found myself in Europe, for example, these kinds of categories change, right? They're super contextual and they're super different, and I am often read in a different way. And so I think in that sense, if we can kind of think about as well, if Climate Mosaic is in a bunch of different places, then we can think about, okay, so in the UK context, we have this sort of, you might talk about BAME, Black and Minority Ethnic Folks. If it's in Germany, then we talk about rassifizierte Menschen, that kind of thing. So I think in that case, you kind of have to really be like very sort of flexible in your approach, but then also be open to messing up, right? I think this happens all the time. People make mistakes. They talk about things in ways that are not super kosher, but then we think, okay, so we learn from this, right? And I think that's maybe a more flexible and open mindset to have.
Yeah, because do you both, because obviously you're involved in stuff around diversity and your research has focused on it. Do you think it's changing in your experience over time? Has it changed at all? Have people become more tolerant? Has it become less tolerant? Has it been harder to talk about?
I can speak from the sphere of venture capital and how things are changing there, but I definitely see improvements. But to your point as well, actually, it really varies by country. I would say the UK is quite a bit further ahead in terms of thinking about, different socioeconomic backgrounds, or also gender, but also race. But when you come to the Netherlands and Germany, the conversation is almost always about gender and not the other forms of diversity. So that's something that I've noticed in particular, and we're trying to do a little bit with Climate Mosaic on that as well. But what we find is our membership in those countries is primarily women, whereas in the UK it's a little bit more mixed.
Oh, wow, that's so. I actually never thought about that, like how different the kind of inclusivity or diversity talk can be in different countries. Do you think, by any chance, like you mentioned, how in the Netherlands it's different, for example, from the UK? Do you think it's possible for the Netherlands, for example, take some practices from the UK and somehow bring them here and use them here?
I definitely do think so, because I think some potentially harder conversations have happened, especially around venture capital. But at the same time, there is a localization element. So I don't want to speak too freely, because I'm not really sure. I can only speak to what I see in terms of the membership. But and also as a British person, maybe I'm seeing more because it's kind of my native country, and I pick up on more things, and maybe there's some nuances I'm missing in the other countries. But at least from what I see, I think the educational level around diversity appears to be higher in the UK. So yes, I would say there's probably some learnings to take, but maybe I hand to you with that one.
So to answer your question, Stefan, about whether it's changing or whether it's growing, I think at a theoretical level, I often think about modernity and how people, conceptualize it as a monolinear thing, kind of always getting better, always improving, when in fact this is not the case, right? We know, for example, that things can very, very easily go south, as we have seen and time again. I mean, look at the history of the United States, look at the history of Germany, look at, like, for example, the emergence of right-wing governments in a lot of places, Greece, for example, Le Pen, all of this, right, in France. So if we can think about all of these contexts and how they aren't necessarily moving, quote unquote, forward, we can also think about, ways to creatively resist that, right? And so in relation to your question about, whether one can take from different contexts and apply, I think yes, right? We can very much be adaptable, but I also am cautious to avoid what Louis Wacan talked about when he said it was valid in some ways, this notion of cultural imperialism from the United States, while saying, you can't impose the same kinds of frameworks coming from, specific contexts wholesale, right? We have to be adaptable. And I think this critique is leveraged against the United States, also against myself in my work sometimes, where people will say, oh, well, you're American, so this means that your analysis doesn't apply. And I will say, well, I'm relying, for example, on very amazing Dutch scholars in the Dutch context, Gloria Wekker, Philomena Essid, right? These people who are very, very, prescient and have been doing the work for decades, right? And so I think there's something to be said about borrowing from a specific context, but then also listening to the people that live there, right? I mean, British sociologists have been talking about race in the UK. I mean, Stuart Hall is one of the people who, pioneered this idea of culture as a site of struggle. British, right? Or Windrush generation, right? So of Jamaican origin, but very British, right? In this sense. And so I think, when we talk about borrowing or applying it, we kind of have to be flexible. And, I also did want to agree with you, Vicky, on this idea that gender takes place of sort of any other notion of identity. Just as a side note, right? In my research in Switzerland, this was something that I found amongst my research participants, right? So people very much say, oh, well, we're not talking about disability, or not talking about ethnicity or religion. It's about gender, right? And so this means that affirmative action in these cases means that women of no other minoritized background will be sort of pushed up the ladder, whereas, for example, women of diverse backgrounds, as though, intersectionality doesn't exist, right? As though these people have, different ideas and different sort of concepts of themselves, they then are sort of ignored in the shuffle. And I think that this has to be said, right? So that's one example, right, where we think of intersectionality as an American construct, right? Kimberly Crenshaw in the American legal system, very, important, but then also we can think about how different identity constructs manifest in different ways, right? So this is applicable in Germany, in Switzerland, in other places. Of course, always very tentatively, very qualified, very thinking about how those categories might look on the ground.
So you both feel like gender takes kind of the main stage over race and other.
In some ways, I would say.
Yeah, but that's to take it in isolation as well.
Yeah.
We don't know where
Yeah.
that stems from. Like,
Yeah.
I think in some countries things can be a little bit more data-driven in a sense of how people discuss things, and gender is probably the main place in which we have data. So that's what
I have a headline that I had here in case that at the CEO level, women finally outnumber men named John. I don't know if you read this article.
No, but I changed my name to Peter on LinkedIn for a while because I don't think women outnumber.
I'm laughing.
Before the recording, I said that almost every person that I've ever known working somewhere that was like in a high position was always named Peter.
Wow, really? Oh, well, there you
There you go.
Yeah. So yeah, okay, I understand that one. But this is actually kind of reminds me, and especially because this article talks about how 3.27% of the American population is named John, and 50% of the people is female, and therefore it's really ironic that women only now outnumber people named John, and then in S&P 500. But it's very data focused. That's how they make their point.
But it's also a beautiful statement, because I think that's one of the best kind of things I've seen around really raising awareness of diversity, because it's so punchy, right?
Yeah.
It's such a good catchphrase.
But it does focus on the gender aspect. And
Yeah.
I think that's an
Yes.
interesting point that you both make. Is, like, I didn't even think about that, but especially in the Netherlands, now the what's the ball drops. Or,
Yeah, I kind of started thinking about it, like looking back also, because I'm a student currently myself. So I started looking back and kind of seeing like what we are being talked to about, what we usually discuss among ourselves. And usually, yeah, I think gender is like the first topic when it comes up when we talk about diversity and inclusion, which is so interesting because I never thought about it, actually.
diversity and inclusion in general, or
No, the fact that gender is the first topic that comes up.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that you say that, like, it's not a linear thing. It doesn't constantly get better. It goes maybe up and down, and depending on a lot of factors, right? So, like, when do we like reach a point where we're okay, like, now let's focus on something else, or
We're diverse and
when-
inclusive.
I feel like a lot of maybe also government policy and stuff is like focused on declaring a win at one point. Is that even possible?
I think it's very hard to define an end goal. We did our best, but we have the benefit of working within a very specific sphere, which is if you could, maybe we still don't even have the data for this, but to some extent, if you could map out the percentages of diversity in some level, you would want to see that level of representation. But we've seen this be applied in other cases and not necessarily work so well. I'm thinking of the US has done things like this before where, it's been challenging, but at least in the end, we had to put a goalpost somehow, and that's what we went for. And so far, it's been working okay. But yeah, can you actually take and say this is finished? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think moving towards an imperfect goal is much better than, throwing your hands up and not doing anything. And at the same time, I think, declaring victory preemptively is also, I think, a sure way to lose, right? And so if we don't, if we're not always constantly in the becoming better, right, in terms of, moving forward towards equality, moving towards equity, moving towards justice, I don't think, I think that's kind of the point, right? Isn't the point to make things better for the people that come after us? So yeah, I think we've lost, actually, if somebody says, oh yeah, now everything's fine, right?
Right.
No.
Well, I feel like, personally, I believe that the more we can educate people at the beginning to already have a certain mindset about certain things, like, you don't need to, there's no fixing the problem. There's only, making sure that people do it right at the beginning, and think in a more inclusive way or more diverse way, or are aware of privileges and biases and whatever not. So
On this topic of inclusivity, I always, I think in the previous episode, I also brought up this experience of mine that I had in my university about the building. In general, I'm really interested in how universities especially try to help people with disabilities or with different impairments to have the same level of education, same experience in their university life. And I think it was already last year. Yeah. So we had this new building built in Rotterdam campus that was, I think, almost fully sustainable. So, which was incredible, and they spent so much money on it. And the first day the building opened, we had this article out in our local magazine about how not accessible this building was. So they used some materials that were really hard, that made it really hard for people with hearing impairments to hear in classrooms. The elevator buttons were somehow behind, a little bit behind, so people in wheelchairs could not access those buttons. And there was basically it was the gray building, and people with, for example, vision impairments also had trouble seeing. And I remember I was sitting there and I was like, how? I thought we were doing so good. And then that happened. And I felt like it was at some point more focused on sustainability, which I get, and of course climate action is really important, but at some point it feels to me sometimes that we forget about those kind of topics of inclusivity and move more to climate action. Do you think that's happening?
I wouldn't say it's specific to climate. I think it's happening across the board, and maybe there's a enthusiasm to pull down something that's like impactful on one front because it's failed on another front. So there's definitely a dynamic of that. But at the same time, this is exactly the kind of problem that we were concerned about with Climate Mosaic, because actually you see it in so many places. Like if you think about the kind of energy system transition, if you don't take socioeconomic factors into this, a lot of the solutions that are being created are for more wealthy groups within society, and then actually other groups are being penalized by this. I can go into the technical details, but it's basically paying for grid infrastructure. It lands on the people that can't afford solar panels and electric vehicles. Or I saw another great startup. A lot of people were coming up with these mobility solutions to help people move more easily, and they'd completely left disability off the kind of thinking. And I met an amazing startup founder who had made this, but also really focused on how do we ensure that people with disabilities can move around London, for example, in a green way. Like, these solutions have to come together. People need to be mindful of it and thinking about it, but I also do firmly believe that you need to have diverse people around the table to make sure it's not just forgotten as well. So yeah, a mix of education and representation is definitely needed.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think this idea of a mix of representation and education is really important. So Stefan, also related to your question around creative or sort of critical thinking, and shout out to my podcast, right? Critical being. This idea of critical being, right? So rather than, because there's a limit, right, that education can take. I say this as an educator, right? There's only so much we can say in order to kind of influence future generations. And then I think we kind of also have to move maybe a little bit away from the cerebralness of messaging. And so I nevertheless, obviously do this podcast, have my other podcast, all of these things saying that there are messages that we want to get out there. But I also think that it doesn't necessarily stem from maybe, acknowledging facts or data, but rather actually kind of moving into this more sort of emotional and effective investment in, for example, marginalized communities. So Lisa, to your point, one of the things that I stress in my research and teaching is this idea of looking at those who are disenfranchised in a number of ways, right? And so I always stem from this place of, if we take care of the people who are most marginalized, then the people who are, somehow better off or more privileged than that will also be taken care of. And this is something that I think of, and I'm reminded of it time and time again. I had this very interesting neighbor when I was living in Switzerland. She was maybe in her 80s. She was very deaf, would speak to me in, very loud Italian, and my Italian is quite good, but I never understood her. And so she was just this really interesting woman. And I remember that there was a tiny set of stairs up to our front door for literally no reason, right? There was no purpose for this set of stairs. And I was thinking, this woman is 80 years old, and every time I would see her, lifting her groceries up to go to the front door, I would always think, why did they not think of the fact that not only are people with disabilities or mobility impairments, affected by this, I mean, God willing, we all get old, right? And so one would think, I mean, that's the goal, right? We all hope to get old, right? One would think that eventually these kinds of benefits for maybe a niche market would also be helpful for the broader population. So that's one example where we can think of, okay, if we take care of the people that need to be taken care of, if we think not so much about, the data costs or the sort of, acknowledging the facts and factors that go into it, and really think about it coming from a place of care, coming from a place of being with these people, we can kind of maybe circumvent some of these more argumentative oppositions to caring about people, right? And I think that this happens quite often, right? Oh, you suggest maybe a solution for folks with disabilities, or folks from the LGBT community, or folks from racialized communities, or whatever, and then the arguments are always like, oh, what about the cost? What about, this? What about the impact on society? How do we incorporate them? What about the logistics? And I don't think that this is the right place to start with. I don't think it's a thinking place, right? And if we rather kind of exist with them or be with them, we can then kind of, like I said, circumvent some of these really thorny problems, I think.
Sorry, I'm speechless. I'm sorry. I'm kind of digesting the information that I just heard.
Yeah. So, am I correct in saying that you're saying that we should not design or think about it as a problem that we need to fix, or that we should take a different angle when thinking about these kinds of issues?
I mean, the thing about human creativity is that it's endless, right? So we can rather than even starting to think about a problem, we can maybe sit with the problem. I think this is, there's a really interesting book by Alexis Shotwell, Against Purity, and it's this notion of kind of just sitting with the trouble. Also talking about sort of Karen Barad, right? So this idea that you can just kind of like sit with something and then exist how you and kind of feel how you exist in relation to this problem. I think so often we kind of grasp towards something without really thinking about what the implications of that grasping really are. And so rather than even framing it as a problem, disability or racial injustice or whatever, we can start thinking about it as a situation that we exist in, that we all collectively exist in, right? And how we can maybe, frame it as something that we can perhaps change, perhaps benefit from, perhaps eradicate, perhaps sit with, right? Just even, start, because again, preemptively declaring victory, I think, is the first way to ensure that you're losing. That's one of the main things that I'm kind of taking away from this podcast, or what I've been talking about for the last however long. Because people really do. They think like, oh well, I have a solution for this, and then. Anyways, Vicky, it looks like you want to say something.
No, actually, I was just laughing at that exact point. The amount of times I have conversations with people and they're like, yeah, okay, so like we're like a gender diverse fund, so we're completely like inclusive and diverse. And I'm like, not quite. I don't know how to break this to you. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you experience that? Could you maybe go a bit more into that? What we were just saying. Do you experience that more often? That people are grasping towards a solution, but maybe don't sit to think about we're in this collective situation.
I think what happens is there's a message that's sent to people that, okay, you need to hit this KPI and you need to do this thing, and it becomes very simple all of a sudden. Like, okay, I hit that KPI and I'm done, and I get to claim the credit and I get to publicize this, and amazing, I can tap myself on the back. So it's exactly what you were describing, like cheering yourself on for reaching the destination when actually you're not really there. So that's how I would go further into that. It's basically people thinking that they've achieved the end goal because they've hit a KPI that was set to them, but actually there's just so much more to do.
For the listeners who don't know what a KPI is, myself included, could you maybe say that? Could you? Different language.
It's absolute business nonsense. That's true. It's a key performance indicator, and people live by it. It's like, in the end, businesses can be a lot of noise. So how do you simplify it into one data result? So, for example, 20% of our team is female, or we invest in 50% founders from Germany. Who knows? But you have a number and you work to it, and then you're done. Yeah. But it's usually not as simple as that.
Yeah, I do feel like a lot of businesses, that's what they kind of do.
Yeah.
They're just like, this is such a big, complex problem. I'm scared, but the market beckons, and I need to kind of move with. Everyone's doing it these days, so I must do it as well. And yeah, it feels like filler. It sometimes feels very disingenuous, like, if you get what I mean. And I don't know why it happens, or that it's. Do you see that a lot in your field?
I think businesses try to run a lot of the time by KPIs, key performance indicators, because it breaks things down into something that's very coherent for everybody to work towards. And in the end, you do need that goal that's actually something that you can tick off eventually and say, I did that. So I think that's kind of where it comes from. And also, it's also frustrating if that doesn't exist. Like, I'm being told that I'm doing something wrong, but you're not giving me any solution or any like end goal, as we were talking to earlier. If there's no end goal for people to get to, then they're just being penalized for something that they can't fix. So it's definitely the nature of business to condense things down into a KPI, and I think that's where people working in diversity and inclusion and thinking about this space need to try and meet business and think, how can I make this digestible, achievable? I don't know if you guys use SMART targets, more business nonsense, but it's basically about something that's measurable, obtainable. I can get there and it's quantified.
Yeah, well, it kind of feels like, you know how they always say, like, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. It's like if you add a KPI to something, you better make sure that during that journey, going to that KPI, that something fundamentally changes in the people that you are, like, showing that KPI. I mean, do you agree with that? Do you feel like that's obtainable? You think that there's people out there that just kind of work on the KPI and then are like, okay, but they don't actually fundamentally care about the issue?
Oh, there's definitely people like that. And to be fair to those people, they're probably working to 60 different KPIs and they're just like, I just need to tick this off and it's done. But yeah, that's the missing link, because the most important thing is, of course, not the KPI, it's the educational aspect here. So how do we make sure that's happening as well? That's one of the challenges. And yeah, what I find is I try and, at least at Climate Mosaic, we try and focus a little bit more on not setting KPIs for people, not dictating, okay, this is your end result. It's more like we just want to support the people who have got here and also support more people to get into there, but that's not necessarily our focus. And there's amazing initiatives that are focusing more on the recruitment side of things and the accessibility side of things. We're focused on, once you're in and you're from one of these backgrounds or you have these diversity traits that mean you might not have access to the same network that others do or the same advantages that others do, how do we facilitate that? Because one of the driving ideas is that with network, you get support. So how can we build very specialized networks for all of these people? And then they can then give back to the next people, and then you create an ecosystem that works better.
Yeah, I feel like I read a paper once. It was like about unconscious bias, but how it compounds effects over how it moves up like a company structure, where it's like, if I get interviewed for my entry-level position and they are like, I'm a guy and there's a guy, okay, this is gender because the paper is focused on gender, but if we bond a bit better over guy stuff, then I get hired, but that guy is my manager and maybe his manager is a guy as well, and how that effect compounds its way all the way to the executive level, and how it would be good, even if artificially necessary, to shake that up. And I feel like that's kind of what you are trying to do with Climate Mosaic a little bit as well. That you hope that if you create a diverse pool of people that are at that position, that it will kind of make its way down and make stuff a bit more diverse.
Absolutely, kind of the decision maker positions. And I think what is nice, and you were asking earlier about how have things changed or improved, what I do see is I think there's more and more awareness around recruitment and like trying to create unbiased processes. And I think that's partially because there's a bit of a toolkit that you can lean on, like make a scoring system, try and make it as objective as possible. But the bit where it gets really hard is then more on the retention side of things. So once they're in, how do you support them? How do you build them up? Because now they're in an environment where they're different. They're just different. And it is human nature to be a little bit less supportive of people who are different than you. So how do you try and tackle that? And that's less that there's a toolkit at this point, and it's more about education. So that's where we're really seeing the issue. And yeah, there's so many different ways to approach this, but we're looking at trying to come in for founders, investors, right at the founder level, getting more diverse people in, and then trying to make sure that the investors funding them are also diverse. But there's so many different ways to try and come at this. We had to pick one that we thought would be incredibly impactful.
So Gian, how do we solve this issue?
Good question.
I wanted to ask you a bit about this paper that you wrote in 2022. I think it was like an analysis of visual items for the UNDP.
Yes. Yeah.
I didn't read the entire paper, I'm sorry, but maybe that's what I was going to have you here anyway. So
sure, we can talk about it.
Maybe you could explain a little bit, because that sounded like very interesting, because you were doing something with visual representations of diversity. Is that
Yeah. So we're looking at my colleague and I, Albert Denk. He's actually at that point he was in Munich. I think now he's in Berlin, at the Humboldt University, and. Hi, Albert, if you're listening. And we looked at specifically representations of diversity with regards to SDG 10, which was it's just about inequalities.
That's
and,
what this podcast
this
is.
is. What this is about. Yeah, here we go. You know, always bringing it back. And you know, we looked at a specific website that had visuals related to the specific goal and how they were sort of representing inequality. And what we found was, and the title. I have, you know, some I've published in between then, so I don't remember the title exactly, but it was something along the lines of obscured, hidden, and covered. Was that it?
Absent, obscured, and hidden.
Obscured, hidden, and covered. Yes, these are the kinds of things. Like when you're not going to, you publish a paper and then you immediately forget about it. It's like, you know. In any case, so it was about the fact that, you know, these representations were somehow covering or hiding or, you know, obscuring the actual identity that they were attempting to represent, right? So what we noticed was the trend of, for example, subjects of inequality were covered with either ethnic headdresses or with hats, or their faces were obscured, or they were wearing sunglasses. So this was quite common. And it was, you know, with discourse analysis, you're not really interested in, for example, author intent, like photographers who are obviously oftentimes working in very limited resources in contexts where they have very little time. But we did notice a pattern across the large data set, and we kind of had to talk about it. So that was kind of what we were getting at with inequality representation.
Oh, I have a question following that. Who do you think that fault is? Like, because you have a data set, and who do you think is behind that? Is it probably intentional if it shows around this huge data set?
Yeah, no, so exactly not, right? And this is the counterintuitive part. One would think one would want to ascribe, and I think this very much goes to, you know, folks working towards KPIs and folks in business trying to, you know, affect change or, you know, or what have you. But I think it's very easy to ascribe intentionality to people we don't understand. So I obviously don't understand venture capitalists, so I can, you know, my go-to might be to say, oh, well, they want to exclude, or oh, they want to be discriminatory, or oh, you know, XYZ. Often reality is not that simple. And so when we have, for example, these representations, again, as a discourse analyst, I'm not interested in intentionality or author intent, because I don't have access to that. I don't know these people. There's so many different photographers and activists out there, but what I did have access to was the representation, the discourse, the images. And so in that sense, we have to then kind of look at the underlying ideology. And as you say, in business and in other contexts, it's really difficult to get at those things. It's a qualitative difference, right? It's not saying, okay, so here we have XYZ, you know, numbers around, for example, this kind of representation, and that is the end of the story. No, it's really looking at, okay, so how did this come to be? Why is it continuing? Will it continue? These are the kinds of questions that obviously, you know, we hope to address in the paper, but also kind of moving forward. When I think about, for example, my current research, I'm interested in underlying mechanisms, because at first blush one would think, oh, you know, it's very simple to say these images are discriminatory, or, you know, these migrants are facing XYZ barriers because of, you know, any number of factors, or, oh, this notion of fitness is only conceptualized in XYZ ways because, you know, very simplistic, you know, 1 + 1 = 2 explanation. But actually, we kind of have to dig a little bit deeper. We kind of have to be a little bit more sort of incisive and critical and analytical. Yeah.
So cool. I'm sorry. I listen and learning so much today. But so, as I understand that, so basically, it's not an intent to do that, but maybe there are some underlying biases that people just have, and there are some reasons for those.
Could be, yeah, could be, right? This is one explanation. But, you know, similar to this idea of reaching towards a problem without actually thinking about it or sitting with it, this is something that I try to do also in my research, right? I try and kind of think about it in all of the different ways. And when I'm analyzing, I think, okay, what is one possible interpretation? What could be another interpretation? How is my interpretation going to you know, come across to the people that read it, to the reviewers, to the larger audience, to the greater academic community. So yeah, I try to think about these things a lot. It's my job, I get paid to do it. But also, you know, it's, yeah, when I think about sort of underlying mechanisms, ideologies, discourses, it's kind of all interwoven in there, and it's really difficult to parse out. So it's kind of why it takes so long to publish a paper.
Makes sense.
Because I find that's why I see a lot of large firms project like communication images, stylistic choices that indicate diversity or inclusion. And then if you look under the surface, it might, or I don't know if they give it a critical review, if I'm saying that correctly. I mean, have you ever come across a company that you were like, whoa, they portray themselves as so sustainable or inclusive or whatever, and then it's kind of like a smokescreen or like an image.
I mean, I just think it's really hard because, again, it's really hard to gather the data. I mean, there's also a whole GDPR piece here. Like, it's hard to gather information. Also, this varies by country, by the way. So, like, in some countries, it's absolutely illegal to ask any questions to your employees about diversity.
Right.
So how are you supposed to monitor improvements on that?
Right.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wait, you've been asking people?
No, just like for example, like I started working recently, and it's so interesting because we have some like I opened, we have this like documents of like, you know, what you need to know when you start working in the company. And there's like pieces on diversity and inclusion and practices that the company has, and we also have some surveys and everything. Like, do you feel safe in the company and all that? But I didn't know that you're not allowed to ask some stuff in other countries.
Well, you can't ask like specifically, to give an example, but you can't in some places ask if people are LGBTQ for obvious reasons. You shouldn't be sending a specific question out asking if this is the case. But then at the same time, how do you then from these surveys you're describing, are you happy, are you comfortable, match that to specific diverse groups?
Yeah.
You just don't have that information.
Really.
So as far as possible, companies will talk about initiatives they've done, that they've heard of great initiatives, or like the thing that they can talk a little bit more about, which is gender and all of this stuff. But actually, it's so hard for them to produce information on these other things. So mainly what I've seen is a lot of qualitative stuff, talking about initiatives, doing what they can, but not much data to back it up. But there's a reason for that.
So are you procuring the data?
There is no data.
There isn't data. Oh, you have to go and get it.
Qualitative is also data.
Yeah, no, sorry.
I say this as a qualitative researcher.
No, you're right.
but
That's absolutely true.
Yeah, it's
That's,
not quantitative for sure.
At least like tracking improvements is difficult. But yeah, for sure. You can gather information on what people feel and if they think it's improving and these kind of things. But well, maybe you have some insights for what people could do to get more insights into the diversity in their organization. But I know a lot of people struggle with this.
Yes, and I completely agree. I've done actually one of the things that I have done in a number of studies is I'll look at the visual representation. For example, a friend of mine and I have done, or a colleague, we're also friends, we did a visual representation analysis of museums here in the Netherlands. And we also had access to the social media managers because they're in charge of so we did have a little bit of access to the author, as it were. And this was, the same sentiment was reflected in the interviews that I conducted, for example, and during my PhD in Switzerland, which was the same context, right? It was visual analyses, and then I asked sort of people who are responsible for these images, like, what's going on here? And what I noticed was the thing that I mentioned earlier, this idea of racial unspeakability, but also just a general sort of emotional avoidance of engaging with diverse topics. And so, and of course it has to do with selling oneself, it has to do with representing one's university. So they're saying, oh yes, we're a very diverse place, we're 85% international. And of course, 65-75% of that is one nationality, right? So it's you have to kind of dig a little deeper when it goes to these sorts of things. But one thing that I can say is for any sort of professional out there who's listening, or if anybody needs any advice in this, in terms of the interviews that I've conducted with professionals, don't be afraid to ask people. I think this is you might mess up, and of course you obviously don't want to have an HR snafu. But I think when interacting with diverse populations, the thing that you have to do is include them. So this is something also related to that topic that we were talking about with disability. Have someone with a disability on your board. Have somebody who is being represented actually photo directing, or have somebody who was, involved in the group actually making decisions. Because if you can, aside from tokenizing, which is also something you don't want to do, this is already kind of a step towards, providing agency, providing representation, and, not being afraid to maybe make some mistakes, right? Because the alternative to this is what I found, for example, at the University of Bern, which was they just removed all images of human beings from their representation, which is also a choice, right? And I fully respect this. I think it was actually quite a smart idea in some ways, because one of the things that I found was this idea of aspirational inclusivity, whereas in Switzerland is quantitatively not a very diverse place, and yet you have these smiling, happy, diverse faces, right? This laughing on campus, these very stereotypical images of people in college brochures, right? And it's like, this doesn't really reflect any sort of real reality. And so I think asking the people who are going to be represented, hey, how do you guys want to be represented, might be an imperfect but necessary first step.
And also, just to jump on that, I think fear is such a big thing. People are so scared to tackle this, so scared to ask people about it, almost paralyzed, I think, sometimes. But there's many thorny topics that businesses have to deal with, and many difficult situations. And, we have so many tools for that. So you can create focus groups. You don't have to say, oh, that's a person with a disability. Let's ask them everything about how things need to get better. You can just create some kind of forum, maybe anonymous, that enables people to actually raise issues or questions or anything, and there's a concept called a town hall, where people just put in anonymous suggestions or questions, and somebody from the senior management gets up and just works through them. So there's a lot of things that businesses do already, and if they just introduced or encouraged to get more feedback on diversity as well, that I think they can already make improvements. It's not quantitative, it's qualitative, but it does avoid this kind of fear and this paralysis that exists.
But I also thank you also for further nuancing that, because another thing to avoid for other people who are practically engaging with this topic is, like I said, not to tokenize people. So again, not going to this disabled person and say, hey, you have a disability, you should be on the board, because there is mountains of research. Sarah Ahmed is a really interesting thinker who has written a number of books about this, right? About how people who identify as diverse, or people who occupy diverse categories, are often called upon to do the labor of diversity work. And there's a whole concept behind this. But so one of the things that I also do in my own praxis is trying to pay people for their time. I think this is really important. Maybe holding space is not what we need. Maybe money is what we need. So that's also a point to keep in mind. But yes, this idea that representation and politics of presence is not just asking one person for their opinion one time. It's actually making sure that person is included in a way that they feel comfortable and safe.
Yeah, because what you were saying about being able to discuss the topic, I find that interesting, because also when we were talking about mental health on our last episode, it's like it's interesting when you talk to someone who has built in that topic as a very free topic to talk about. I think another one is when we were at the National Exposition at Enactus. Maybe I should explain Enactus real quickly to you.
Yeah, because I think that if someone is not aware of what that is, might be a little confusing.
Yeah. So, would you like to do it as?
Yes.
Okay.
So basically, Enactus is an student organization that focuses on social entrepreneurship. Basically, it operates around the world, and we also have Enactus in the Netherlands in each big university here. Basically, each association unites students who want to either have their own startups that focus on one of the SDGs, or want to join already existing one. Basically, the whole idea is to try to solve some kind of issue that we have using all the resources that you have as a student. And I can say from my own experience, I'm part of one of the Enactus teams in Rotterdam, and I've been working there for the past 2 years. I'm going to be my 3rd year, and I find it really inspiring, because so many incredible people are joining and trying to figure out something new, but at the same time, sometimes a little depressing, because as students, sometimes you don't have enough knowledge and you don't know what to do. And I think that was one of the reasons also for this podcast, to kind of unite academics who have the knowledge and about some theoretical concepts, and people from business area who actually know the practical knowledge behind those concepts, and kind of bring them together and see what we can do. And one of the main events of the year that we have in Enactus is National Exposition, which is this huge event where all the teams from all over the Netherlands come to one city and compete, representing these little projects that they've been working on for the whole year. Do you want to...
Oh, yeah. So thank you. That was actually a really great explanation. And after that, we should talk about SMAC real quick.
Yeah.
But there was a project there, and they did something with reusable period stuff. I think M period.
M period, yeah.
I don't know from which Enactus they were, but it was kind of funny because there's a stigmatizing thing around discussing periods, especially as a guy, you know. But it was so interesting to see the amount of confidence that they could talk about it, and I was like, I told them, I said, "Whoa, you guys talk really confidently and easily about this topic, and I feel a bit odd about it because I never speak about this." And they're like, "Yeah, but you know, if you have to pitch and you're talking about it all day, so it's like, you know, it's part of your the DNA of their organization, and therefore it makes it a lot easier to talk about." And going back to our last episode, we were talking about mental health. It was the same thing. It's like, you know, if you make it part of your DNA as an organization, it makes it so much easier to talk about. And I feel like maybe what I'm getting from you, Gian, is maybe for diversity's sake, that's also a thing, right? If we can be more open and include it more into our discourse on the work floor, it might become more easy.
Yeah. I think that that's one piece. And then also to kind of acknowledge and sit with the inherent inequalities and power disparities, I think, that come with diversity, right? Because it's not as though, and you know, maybe 21st century modernity might assert this, but it's not as though that we're all sort of equally different in different ways, and that everybody is a special snowflake and these kinds of things. It's that we all come from a historically oriented place that has, in the current moment, caused inequalities. And I think that might be where the discomfort comes from. People don't necessarily want to acknowledge privileges when they have them. And this is something that I think, you know, if you make it quote unquote part of the DNA of your institution or your organization, you can't, I would agree, it would make it much, much easier to talk about how people are, you know, feeling uncomfortable, or how people are feeling unwelcome or non-belonging in the space. You know, for example, in institutions, if I notice that I am the only one, whatever that is, in the room, and I can't really talk about it in terms of power, then it becomes, oh, well, why is he talking about this, or why is this a problem? So I think it's not only acknowledging diversity or acknowledging difference, but also in acknowledging power imbalance. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I was wondering, Vicky, like, since you're now more involved in that with Climate Mosaic, like, is that something you noticed that instead of like where you used to work, you know, your other jobs, and maybe now that it's more part of your space of operations, that it becomes easier to discuss this kind of stuff, the acknowledging the issues, discussing the solutions?
Mm-hmm. So Climate Mosaic is something I do on the side.
Okay.
It would be wonderful if it was more of my time, because it is a very safe space for that and very open discussions. But I also continue to work with different startups on lots of different things, and some of the environments I walk into are way more open, and some of them a little bit less open, and you can feel that. But to what you were describing, I think one of the most impactful things that I've seen, and even to just give an example, is when you get very senior people just being a bit more vulnerable about whatever, but they open up this vulnerability and this kind of culture of talking openly about struggles, and then it kind of enables people to talk about it from a diverse lens, or not, but often from more of a diverse lens. So a very easy one that I've seen has been senior management, white men. You know, people like say, oh, what can white men bring to the table here? But that's absolutely not true. I've seen they're talking openly about somebody in their family with issues, or they're talking about their own family struggles. Like, they've had a child recently, they're really struggling to balance different things. And then that makes other people feel more comfortable that they can also be vulnerable as well. So a bit of a rambly answer, but I just think vulnerability is such a big topic.
Well, it's a very rambling topic. I think the point of this conversation is not to solve all the issues, right? But I do believe that it would be great if a new wave of people that are starting businesses and stuff could learn from what is going on right now and engineer it to be better in the beginning rather than have to rely on, oh no. I mean, same goes for a lot of topics, like, sustainability as well. It's like, instead of trying to say, oh no, now we have to be sustainable, to build it up from in your DNA of your organization to begin with. So I think that was one of the things that I hope to get from this conversation. I was wondering, like, you both have been in a lot of countries, Japan and Argentina and Switzerland. Like, how does culture play into all of this? Am I pulling open a very big can of worms here, or is it?
Culture is huge. Like, I mean, all of this actually ties into culture anyway, but culture is such a big thing. As we were saying earlier, perceptions around diversity and inclusion vary depending on culture, but I actually just want to say this. Please, everyone, read The Culture Map, because it's such a good book in terms of business. So if you have an international team, it's amazing how many frictions can emerge because of different cultures. And if you take a bit of time, The Culture Map is a starting point. There's so much further you can go. But just having that awareness of it really makes a huge difference. And for me, I found that a really good toolkit in terms of working in different countries and cultures. I mean, whether that's a national difference in terms of culture or a professional difference, going from the nuclear industry to the finance industry to more of the startup industry, it's always very good to set kind of the scale of how people are communicating with each other and how perceptions might vary because of this. So I think, nationality and the kind of culture that you're born with is such a huge topic here.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I teach a course in intercultural communication, and we spend at least 2 or 3 meetings talking about just the definition of culture. So I just briefly, kind of just say a couple of words about it. I think, oftentimes people think about culture as this sort of unchanging, sort of given notion about that is inherent to people's identities, when in fact we know that culture looks different on the ground. Culture is a way of thinking, a way of being. It's a way of existing in the world. It's a way of navigating different spaces, and it changes often based on the context in which we find ourselves. So, if, for example, cultural mores, cultural ideas, cultural values in Argentina are obviously very different at different scales as well, right? If we talk about, as you mentioned, industrial or institutional cultures, we can think of, for example, LGBT culture in Argentina is very different from LGBT culture in Germany, for example, right? And then we can also talk about subcultures, which is a somewhat strange term because it positions them below a national culture, which is not necessarily the case. But yeah, I think in general, when talking about culture, we kind of have to, realize that it's not necessarily something that is fixed. It's rather sort of debatable and fluid construction. So that's, when looking at, for example, institutions, oftentimes people ascribe issues of personality to culture. So they'll say like, oh, it's just their culture. No, you're just kind of a jerk. Like that's also a possibility, right? But then we kind of have to think about what does culture mean in this context. So I think in general, I have like a lot to say about culture, but I'll stop there.
But it does tie into the whole thing. Do you feel like when you're talking, for example, about views on accommodating for disability, that culture plays a big part? I mean, you were saying that in England they look different against certain aspects than they do here in the Netherlands. So, is it a predicting factor maybe, or is it something that we need to take into account when trying to make the world as inclusive as possible?
I think it's one of many lenses that you need to apply. And yeah, sometimes people are just jerks. So, but you can look at, oh, there's this lens that I should think about, this lens that I should think about, which is a cultural layer, and then maybe there's this lens, and then they used to work here, and then they burnt out actually. So then this was, like it's just one of many things that you need to factor in. I would be wary of ascribing like specific things around diversity to specific cultures, because I just think the picture is much more complex than that. But yeah, you do see variation. I think that's obvious, but definitely a clear thing. You can zone in on one particular point in one particular country and build a picture, but it's hard to disentangle that into specific, like, this is why this is.
I get what you mean. It's at the same time, it goes all over the place. So let's hypothetically say that there's like 1 million people listening, and they're all students, and they're all trying to start startups, right? Like, if you, knowing what you guys know, how would you design like a startup that is as inclusive as possible? What kind of, like, what would you focus on?
Well, if I can start with one thing, if there's 1 million people kicking off startups, I really love what you were talking about earlier with Enactus, that there's an impact element to it, because I really believe that all the most successful startups in the future, all the future unicorns, are going to have impact as a part of what they're doing. And impact doesn't come at a compromise in financial return. The way that society is moving now, impact has to be what you're driving, and impact is where the money is to be made as well. Not to sound so capitalist about it, but that's a fundamental belief of mine, and that's why I've always worked in impact investment. So if you're starting a startup, firstly, think about impact and where you can make a difference, because that's what we need in the world, and that's where you can be successful. And then if you're thinking about diversity as well, I really would think about it straight from the co-founder level. Like, have the people that are ideating with you, coming up with the whole business plan with you, as different from you as possible. I mean, that's a general business rule anyway. Try and have people with differing opinions, but factor diversity into that as well. And then get diverse investors and contribute to this beautiful ecosystem that's emerging.
Yeah, this is more when people want to start startups, I think that's great. I wouldn't say that I'm by any means an expert in this, but I would think if you want to foster diversity and really foster an inclusive environment, it goes back to Stefan, what you were saying about acknowledging diversity and I really getting into this sort of idea of acknowledging privilege and being okay with giving up privilege in a lot of ways. Those of us that have privilege, so for example, I am a cisgender, able-bodied male. This has afforded me a huge amount of privilege in a lot of ways. And being able to kind of magnify the voices of the marginalized is, I think, a really important aspect when wanting to foster diversity and inclusion in any institution you enter, not only startups. But yeah, I would have to say, if you want to be inclusive, then you actually have to qualitatively do that kind of work, right? So it's not about KPIs. It's not about quantitatively saying, okay, we have someone from the global south, we have somebody who is whose body is different in some way, we have somebody who is a member of the LGBT community. It's really about consistently fostering an environment in which that person feels capable of doing and providing the things that they are going to provide.
Can I ask, so these 1 million students that are all kicking off startups, is the idea that the startup is specifically tackling a problem that's related to diversity, or they're trying to build a startup and make sure that they're
Thank
diverse?
You for asking.
Thank you.
Because
That's such a good
I was just going to say, maybe we can talk about SMAC for a second.
So as I mentioned already, Enactus unites some projects that tackle different SDGs. And we have this one project in Rotterdam, actually, that's called SMAC, which is a catering company. But what they do, they employ refugees, and they offer them a place to work and cook Middle Eastern food, which I find so inspiring. And every time I meet those people who work there, this is just so incredible. And the end goal of this whole thing is to help those refugees, kind of give them this first place of work, to give them a chance to, throughout this time, prepare the documents and basically at the end become the Dutch citizen, which is incredible. But of course, there are so many challenges that come with these kind of ideas. And I also talk to my friends that are part of this project, and they constantly tell me, like, they talk to these people with inspiring stories, and they try to help them as much as they can. But at some point, as students, they don't have the reach, they don't have the ability to actually help them fully. So they right now finding partners who actually are in the government and try to help with the documents as much as they can. But I also feel like it's such a, especially with refugee topic, I feel like it's such a hard thing to actually work with and tackle. I don't know how they do that.
Yeah, I think in Actis Netherlands specifically, the idea is always to create an organization that is can be profitable, so that there's like a business model involved, but that has also a societal impact that works on one of the SDGs. I think Rotterdam does that, sort of, yeah. Ask Lisa about Rotterdam, that's her own project. Other enactors in different countries maybe usually are not so focused on generating profits or like a self-running business, but more so tackling one large issue altogether.
Yeah.
And there's some amazing projects, like I think
God.
like we have in Enactus Egypt, I think they do something with invasive fish species or something like that. But it's like a multi-million-dollar project that they're running there. Some students, it's insane.
And then we make 100, and our project, we're like, wow, we are so incredible. We made so much money. But
I could, well, if and maybe you have a comment around the refugee angle here, but the one thing I would say to not lose sight of here is it's absolutely a brilliant story and it's wonderful, and that will get promotion, but never lose sight of what the actual, who is the customer here and what do they want? Because what they want is a brilliant restaurant experience.
Yeah.
And is the team really focusing on this as well? And is it profitable? And is it growing? And are they making sure they're studying as much as they can about this business model, as you were saying? Because in the end, the way that you really drive impact is by making a brilliant business. And of course, the fact that there's refugees coming in here is brilliant and it adds to the story. But in the end, it needs to be a fantastic restaurant.
yeah.
Well, it's a good question. I think, Gian, we were talking about this a little bit beforehand. I agree with you. I feel like if you are doing very well as a business, you have the means to make even more impact.
You inherently make the impact with being a successful business.
But it's a balancing act between losing sight on what you're on the impact that you're trying to create. It feels like a delicate balancing act sometimes.
I don't see it that way. I see you're building something, and in building that, you create impact. I mean, of